Good morning, everybody. So welcome to our lecture with Valerie Lannon and David Bush on the Green New Deal and the socialist case against the carbon tax. My name is TRACY, and I'm the professor for the environmental praxis class at St. Thomas University, which is hosting today's lecture. This lecture is also being organized in partnership with the MD Media Co-op and Raven. Raven's a research project on media and activism for rural, environmental, and social justice based at the University of New Brunswick. So I also want to begin by acknowledging that this event is being organized in unceded territories of the Wolastoqey. So these lands are subject to the peace and friendship treaties signed in the 1700s between the British Crown and the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, Abenaki, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot peoples living in parts of what are now called the Maritimes, Gaspé, and the northeastern United States. And I hope, this lecture series has been part of honoring those peace and friendship treaties. When we talk about environmental problems, we of course should all be considering that we here on the Wolastoqey territories are treaty peoples and have a responsibility to honor those treaties. So before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to mention, so for our speakers' benefit maybe, and others, that we are joined by several folks who are well known in the environmental community and social justice community. I just wanted to say hello to Alain Deneau, who's an author on tax havens and Canadian mining companies. We also have folks here with Community Forest International, an organization based in New Brunswick that does good work on forest conservation and community forests. So our speakers today are Valerie Lannon, who is a co-founder of the Spring Socialist Network. She supports climate justice and Indigenous rights and is the co-author of Indigenous Sovereignty and Socialism. And has spent her career working in Vancouver and is now back in Ontario. David Bush is a Ph.D. student in social political thought at York University, a labor organizer, active with the Fight for 15, contributor to the Spring magazine and an editor at Rankandfile.ca. So I'm now going to turn it over to Valerie, I think, who's speaking first. Is that right? No, David. Dave is speaking first. Thanks.
So thank you for having me and us. I'm going to talk a little about the carbon tax and kind of try to present a little bit of a socialist case critiquing it. And I think that that's still relevant and important as we do have a carbon tax in Canada, and that is still a live political debate. And then Valerie's going to talk more fun stuff about the Green New Deal or whatever. And I think we'll try to keep our comments relatively short and have a discussion. So I just wanted to quickly just outline the carbon tax, I think, comes from this idea that what is missing or what the problem is that there's a market misfunction. It's not working, that externalities in the capitalist system, such as pollution and carbon, are somehow missed within the price mechanism. And that what we need to do is put a price on those things so capitalism can function better. And therefore, a market mechanism will actually rein in output of carbon. That's essentially what the idea is that the price that will be put on carbon will actually really reflect a real market, and that has been missing, and then that is why carbon emissions have skyrocketed over time. And essentially, this is a theory about extending the market in order to combat climate change. And I think that this radically misdiagnoses the problem and in many ways makes it much, much worse. Now, there are a couple of technical issues with it. One is that how carbon is priced. So what is the price of carbon? Second, is the jurisdictional problem. Where is carbon priced? So carbon can be priced in one country or one province, or would it require something like a global price on carbon for it to actually work as a market mechanism? But I would say that this going down this path forecloses more substantive changes. Partly the way in which it functions in most jurisdictions that have brought in carbon pricing and essentially a carbon tax is that it usually comes with many, many different kinds of offsets and loopholes for industry and business. Now, part of this is that there's a slow, in Canada, the federal pricing of carbon and the carbon tax is a slow escalation upwards. And there's two tiers. There's one, there's a tier essentially on for individuals, which pay at the point of getting gas and things like that. And that's a relatively low price point, and that will over years go up and up. And then there is also a carbon price and tax on emissions for business, but there's a certain threshold limit. You have to have meet a certain threshold limit of carbon emissions to be taxed, and there's all sorts of opportunities to have offsets. And these many loopholes are replicated over many jurisdictions around the world that have brought in various schemes of carbon pricing and carbon tax. And none of this has really particularly worked out well. So in British Columbia brought in a carbon pricing scheme and tax in 2008. And, assessments, about 10 years later or 8 years later, some studies that looked at what was the relative outcome of this carbon pricing scheme and carbon tax scheme in British Columbia, it saw no real reduction in emissions or nothing really significant. That the level of offsets and loopholes built into the system meant that essentially things carried on the same. And you can see why business likes the carbon tax. So one of the big backers in the United States of carbon tax is Exxon. Now, you telling me that Exxon supports good climate policy, I have a bridge to sell you. The reason why business loves carbon tax and carbon schemes is because over many jurisdictions, they have different regulations in which they can horse trade and trade off and shuffle around their emissions capacity and look like they are actually taking climate action when really they're forestalling it. But I would say the biggest problem with the carbon tax is actually political. In one, it doesn't empower people. It treats the solving of climate issue as a purely technical issue, and that it's this sort of like reform from above that goes on to the backs of people, and it is perceived by many people, rightly or wrongly, as a tax on them, and that big business gets to sort of skate along relatively unscathed. And that when people are already scraping by, these ideas of carbon tax that escalate over time builds real resentment. And it builds resentment in that the right wing is able to capitalize on that real resentment of being taxed and saying that you as an individual have to solve, like you're part of the problem, and that you have to pay the price to solve climate change relative to what business has to pay. And you can kind of see this in movements played out over like in other parts of the world. So the Yellow Vest movement, which in 2018, which was massive, was a response to Emmanuel Macron's implementation of a whole series of taxes, one of them being the carbon tax, a fuel tax, essentially, that people were really pissed. And I know that the Yellow Vest movement in Canada was a right-wing weirdo show, but there it was a legitimate popular movement that, yes, attracted some right-wing movements, but it's also very left-wing. Many unions came out for it. Mostly it was a very working class rural movement, and people were rightfully pissed at Macron and feeling like they were the ones who were being forced to pay for climate action rather than the interests of this big business. And you can kind of see how this is playing out in polling. So last summer, a couple of polls that I think a lot of people might be familiar with. There's the Abacus poll about, you know, what are you willing to kind of support to deal with the climate crisis? One, there's a big majority for people seeing it is a climate crisis and a climate emergency. Two, there was a wide plurality of support for World War II level investments to actually address climate change. But at the same time, another poll by Forum showed that support for carbon pricing carbon tax was at 28% support versus 42% did not like that. And you can kind of see that these two things are sitting side by side. People want to see systemic change, but if it feels like more of the same, just like another kind of flat tax or a tax on you as an individual that you will have to pay, that you don't necessarily feel empowered, there's not going to be much support for it. And in a way, solutions that aim to atomize individuals, like a tax, rather than empower them to be able to think about remaking the economy, are not going to feel very popular. And they are going to, I think, feed the right-wing resentment. That is why people like Doug Ford and people like, you know, what was Andrew Scheer, but people like now Aaron O'Toole will continue to play on and continue to draw on to forestall and attack any kind of climate action. And if that's a solution that we're putting forward or front and centering in fighting climate change, it's actually debilitating in our ability to actually win broad support amongst the working class to be able to support real policies that actually get to the root of it. Because at the end of the day, carbon pricing does not actually work. It extends market relations rather than, I think, kind of saying that the market itself and capitalism itself systemically needs to be reorganized, and our economy needs to be something different than what it is right now, rather than more of the same, which is carbon pricing. And that we need to actually empower Indigenous communities and empower workers to feel like they have more of a say in our economy, in planning our economy and what that looks like. And the carbon pricing does the exact opposite. And I think it really is a hindrance in our ability to build the political will to be able to actually do the things that will address climate change in the here and now.
Thanks, Dave. I think Valerie, I think you're muted.
You'd think I'd know by now. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Dave, and thanks especially to TRACY GLYNN for this kind invitation. So I'm going to be talking about the Green New Deal and socialist perspectives for change. I'll start with a brief description of the Green New Deal and a bit of its history, and then follow with an analysis of its strengths and challenges, and conclude by pointing to some possible steps forward. To this day, the Green New Deal is best known in the country where it originated, the US, where a resolution that described its key principles was introduced to Congress by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey in February 2019. And it was widely campaigned for in the States by the youth-led Sunrise Movement. But contrary to the accusations made by both Republicans and the establishment of the Democratic Party, the Green New Deal, in fact, did not figure in any real way in the recent campaign platforms of even progressive Democrats. In Canada, the campaign was taken up at what was called the Pact for a Green New Deal in the summer of 2019, and was particularly promoted by the LEAP organization and Canada 350 and others. And in some ways, the Pact for a Green New Deal built on the earlier policy work of the LEAP manifesto. And in the 2019 Canadian federal election, the youth-led Our Time campaign promoted candidates who endorsed the Pact for a Green New Deal. And while this was going on, the Red Nation was promoting the Red Deal, which shares a number of principles of the Green New Deal, but explicitly centers Indigenous sovereignty. I think all of these initiatives should be credited with providing a vast improvement over earlier campaigns of the environmental movement, whose focus was pretty narrowly on decarbonization. What the Green New Deal represents is an acknowledgement that the climate crisis cannot be addressed properly without taking into account the coexisting economic and social crises that we face, so that the fight for economic equality and anti-racism are intertwined with arguments for decarbonization. There is particular recognition that climate change, while posing an existential threat to all of us, is having and will have a much more profound effect on low-income and racialized peoples. This is true not only on a global level, where countries in the global south are already facing the worst features of climate change, with unbearably high temperatures and rising seas that are forcing the relocation of populations. And of course, it must be said that these populations are the least responsible for climate change. But it's also true within countries. You could think of Hurricane Katrina, but more recent examples, where racialized people and those on low incomes had the least amount of resources to deal with the record-breaking high temperatures, floods, and hurricanes. At the same time, it is some of the hardest hit communities, including Indigenous ones, that are leading the struggle for climate justice. And we are most familiar with their valiant efforts to stop any number of pipelines here on Turtle Island. Another theoretical advance of the Green New Deal over earlier environmental statements is the emphasis put on what is finding just transition for workers and communities that will be impacted by the shift to a fossil-free future. When we think of a place like Fort McMurray, we need to consider not only those people directly involved in the industries and oil and gas, but all those who have jobs that depend on those workers. So think of caregivers, restaurants, trucks and travel, etc. And in addition, their taxes help fund local public services. And so we see the popularity of the term "no worker left behind." And it is the role of workers, as workers fighting simultaneously against oppression and against exploitation, that we believe is paramount to winning the war for climate justice. And make no mistake, the climate war is one being fought hard by the long-standing and enormous power of the fossil industry. And we can't be fooled by its current greenwashing and push for climate geoengineering. I have nothing against science, and I hope that there is a scientific solution, but what's on offer so far either doesn't work, is hideously expensive, or certainly unaccountable to us in terms of how it's being developed, and in some cases quite dangerous. We agree with Marx's contention that capitalism creates its own gravediggers in the form of the working class, that only the working class, acting in its interests against capital, has the potential and power to create the clean and just world we all need. And while the recognition in the Green New Deal and exhortations that no worker be left behind are admirable, we need to do a reality check on where the working class stands with respect to climate justice. It is fair to say that in the fall of 2018, when the IPCC issued its annual report with real alarm bells ringing for the first time, the working class, which forms the majority of the population, understood the gravity of the situation. And this showed up definitely in polling at the time. But workers were not always clear about the best way forward, and policies like the carbon tax, which was and is one of the main so-called solutions offered by the ruling class, did nothing to clarify things. In fact, it created resistance when stoked by the most conservative anti-tax spokespersons, as Dave has described. But within the Green New Deal itself, the call for just transitions has fallen short. Some of you might know the reading of Professor Dimitris Stevas from the Colorado State University, who has written extensively on the topic of just transitions and has documented the positions of various unions and sectors. And not surprisingly, his findings show that calls for climate justice and changing to a fossil-free economy have their strongest support in the health, education, and social service sectors, and least support in the construction trades and fossil fuel sectors. And you see that in Canada with big support, let's say, for the Pact for a Green New Deal coming from CUPE, the Public Sector Union, and the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. That hesitancy and opposition is because there is no clear, secure path for a just transition that maintains dignity and financial security for these workers. And one of the clearest positions on all of this that I've heard has been articulated by Sarah Nelson, who's president of the Association of Flight Attendants and Communication Workers on America. And actually, I think her name's being floated as a possible Secretary of Labor in the Biden cabinet. She told the labor publication, which is called In These Times, she said, first and foremost, there has to be a recognition that labor has never seen an actual just transition. You can say those words all day long, but what people hear is a couple of hours of training and then you're going to leave my community devastated and alone like a ghost town, because that's been the reality of these things. So there's a zero trust. If you want to build trust, you need to do two things. One, you need to shore up the wasteland that's already been created where there was no just transition. And you think of all those communities in the Rust Belt is a really good example. Second, a just transition needs to talk about how we start the transition process early. We need to get into these communities, talk with them about their needs, and get to know them. So I really like what she said there. But where does that leave us in terms of next steps? We certainly don't want to be in a position where we are or seem to be merely yapping from the sidelines, ever critical of what others are doing, but not helping to organize and support real movements in any way. While it is true that the COVID pandemic has dealt a serious blow to the momentum of the mainstream environmental movement, when things like Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg seem like faraway phenomena, there remain strong calls to have the post-pandemic economy lean on a fossil-free future. Demands for so-called system change abound, but what kind of system are we talking about? If we believe that capitalism is the root of planetary destruction because of its reliance on fossil fuels and its ongoing extractivism, labor exploitation, and social oppression of all kinds, then how do we make the change to socialism? In order to defeat capital, workers need to be united across all forms of oppression. They need to be clear in their goals, and they must be confident that they can achieve those goals. How do we link the day-to-day concerns of ordinary workers to climate justice, especially when we see no real leadership from trade union officials or the NDP, and when demands for just transitions are justifiably met with huge skepticism? As with any form of change, we need to start with where people are. And people are angry as hell with decades of neoliberal cuts to services, with stagnant low wages, with precarious jobs. They are fed up with murderous police running roughshod through their neighborhoods. They are fed up with continued willful ignoring of treaty rights and past promises around reconciliation. And people are rightly shocked at the ill treatment of migrant workers, especially during the pandemic. Unfortunately, many of these angry people are rising up in different ways. Our task is to support these movements, to link them together, to amplify their voices, all for the purpose of highlighting their common enemy as capitalism and building the confidence to overthrow it. So let's get concrete. There has been a years-long campaign, mainly in Ontario, but certainly elsewhere, for provincial governments to include provisions for paid sick leave in their labor standards. While the federal Liberals have recently made a slight, highly provisional and short-term nod in this direction, the provinces, including the NDP and BC, remain silent. Think of it this way. What seems more achievable from the point of view of the average worker? Winning at least a few paid sick days, especially during a pandemic, or dismantling the entire oil and gas industry? Similarly, there is widespread support for the Black Lives Matter movement. By amplifying that voice through encouraging organizations that we're part of, especially the labor movement, to walk in support and take up the Black Lives Matter demands to defund and abolish police and prisons, we build the clarity around the need for a united class and the confidence that comes with seeing big numbers out in the streets and ideally taking workplace action like sick-ins, occupations, and strikes. Right now, the Ontario Federation of Labour is making great relationships with what's called the 1492 Land Back Lane Group, which is in Haudenosaunee territory, just west of Toronto, against the incursions of a would-be subdivision developer. We need to be telling this story and encouraging more of Labour to get involved in these and similar struggles, such as the ones to stop pipelines or the recent strike by Dominion workers in Newfoundland and Labrador. Another angle on this is one articulated by Naomi Klein, namely that caring jobs are what she calls climate jobs or low carbon jobs, and that we need more of them and they deserve better pay and recognition. The role of farm workers, caregivers, grocery store workers are receiving only rhetorical support from governments as heroes of the day during the pandemic. But thank goodness we have the Migrant Rights Network pushing for immediate immigration status for all, that we have a decent work movement pushing for at least a $15 minimum wage, equal pay for equal work, and paid sick days. It is through actively participating in these movements rather than, say, a sole focus on electoral campaigns or solely on decarbonization efforts, only through participating in these movements, not only as individuals, but pulling in organizations of which we're a part, that we take the steps needed for a better world. If we want climate justice, we need to be part of the fights that are happening in the here and now. If you want to learn more about how the Spring Socialist Network operates on these principles, you can go to our websites, our Instagram, or contact us at info@springmag.ca. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Valerie. And yeah, thank you, Valerie and Dave.